Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the Castlevania Anniversary Collection review. If you missed part 1, you can find it here in the card above, or in the description down below. Now in this part, I'll be talking about both 16-bit Castlevania games, Super Castlevania IV for the Super Nintendo, and Castlevania Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis. And while I was editing this video, I went to my local record shop and found this. Yep, it's the Castlevania NES trilogy. They were all next to a game called The Challenge of the Dragon, which looked neat, but I ain't spending $100 on an NES game. But I did get the Castlevania trilogy from there, and are now safe in my possession. Don't worry, MS, wherever you are, they're in good hands. Now let's continue. Super Castlevania IV, or Akumajo Dracula in Japan, originally released in 1991 for the Super Nintendo. The game is kind of a retelling of the events of Castlevania 1 in a way. It depends on the localization, because in the original English localization, the game takes place after Castlevania II Simon's Quest, instead of 1961, like in the original Castlevania. To me, it's just another retelling of Castlevania 1. You play as Simon Belmont, the man whose bloodline is to kill the evil Lord Dracula again. Now, since it's kind of a remake of Castlevania 1, the whole game is styled after the gameplay of Castlevania 1. It still has its level-to-level platforming, but this time with a 6 to 8 way whip attack. Because of that, the whip in this game is kind of broken and overpowered, where in the older games you could only attack in front, but since this is a multi-directional attack, it makes a lot of enemies kind of easy, and more of an annoyance than an actual challenge. And for the first time in a Castlevania game, there's a dedicated sub-weapon button. In this case, since it's an SNES game, it's the R button, and overall the game's control is tight and responsive. Rarely did I feel like I was fighting the control like in the original NES game. Anyway, you go through the levels, defeat bosses, and make your way through the end to fight Dracula, simple Castlevania style, same as the first one, but with more platform challenges like in Castlevania 3. And like in Castlevania 3, they go a bit overboard with the bullshit bottomless pits, especially near the end of the game. And speaking of near end game, the last stage is absolute hell. 3 straight difficult bosses, 2 of them who become early game bosses in Symphony of the Night, before you can fight Dracula, and it's one hell of an endurance run. But thankfully, there's a secret area before the Dracula fight that'll fill your health and hearts up. Now, there's one thing that the game does amazingly. Like at all Castlevania games, it's its music. To me, one of the big moments in the game is when the game is starting to load, and you hear a slow but familiar tune. Then you load up into the next stage, then Bloody Tears kicks in. And boy, does it sound great. Then the next stage, with Vampire Killer. And to end it all, the beginning from Castlevania 3. For the final stage of the game, it's rather fitting, and it fits really well for a final stage after playing the NES Castlevanias. And finally, you have the last song when you fight Dracula. You have this dramatic song after a rather fitting one for the Dracula fight. But then, Dracula is near his final health bars. The second phase starts. Silence. And it's the song from the first stage, Simon's theme. A fitting way to end this game. Overall, Super Castlevania IV is both a fantastic Castlevania game and just a great game in general, with just a massive difficulty spike at the end, but I enjoyed it. And this game alone is worth the collection, honestly. A quick note, so this isn't the only Castlevania game on the Super Nintendo, the other being Castlevania Dracula X, but it isn't in the Anniversary Collection. So back to the Wii U Virtual Console depths you go. Well, maybe another day. Now let's get out of Nintendo territory and move on to the land of blast processing with Castlevania Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis. Castlevania Bloodlines, also known as Castlevania The New Generation in Europe, and known as Vampire Killer in Japan, released in 1994, a game that I have surprisingly amount of history with. I was personally raised as a Super Nintendo kid, so I avoided the Sega until the Dreamcast, but then I had a friend who had a Sega Genesis, and when I would go to his house, I would play this game constantly. Anyway, this Castlevania game is not based on the Belmont name, but its descendants. You play as John Morris, who wields the legendary Vampire Killer whip, and is the son of Quincy Morris from Bram Stoker's original novel. And then you have Eric Lecarde, who uses the Alucard Spear, a special spear created by Alucard himself that he would later use in the Saturn version of Symphony of the Night. So that's neat. Taking place in the 19th century, 1917 to be exact, in this game, instead of going through the outskirts of Dracula's castle, this time you go through Europe. From the Atlantis Shrine in Greece, to the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy,
Buongiorno.
to a munitions factory in Germany, to the Versailles Palace in France, and finally, the Castle Proserpina in England, where Elizabeth Bartholdi, who is trying to resurrect Dracula, is currently residing. You go through the same stages no matter what character you pick, so go for it, but in some stages you go in different directions. With John, since he has the Vampire Killer, he has some of the same moves as Simon from Super Castlevania IV, except with a bit more limited movement. He can still whip in many directions, but only when midair. He can whip swing in any ceiling instead of having a specific wall ring to hang on, but John can only swing and not just hold unlike Simon. Eric, on the other hand, can't swing on ceilings, but he can do a super jump straight from Super Mario Bros. 2. You hold down, wait until the charge, and then press jump. Unlike John, Eric doesn't need to jump attack diagonally. He can do it from the ground, and only from the ground. And like every other Castlevania game from this time, you have sub-weapons. 3 in this case, the Battle Axe, the Holy Water, and the Bladed Boomerang, that both John and Eric can use. Each character eventually will get a power-up to their weapons, whether it'll be a Flame Whip for John or a Blazing Spear for Eric, and each come with its own specific sub-weapon, with John having the Water Dragon, a mystical orb that homes in enemies and attacks it, while Eric has the Thunderbolt Spear, where a horde of lightning bolts go full screen and hit enemies around you. I will say though, this game likes its mini-bosses, like, a lot. Like, they bought the enemy health bar, and they're going to use the enemy health bar. And stages overall just seem more difficult than the other games, but that just might be me from playing Castlevania IV right before this. Once you beat the game, it tells you to try Expert Mode. And all it does, after you beat Expert Mode, gives you an extra cutscene that's not really worth it. And yeah, I'll pass. You get a nice little bonus ending, but it's just one more cutscene, so you can just YouTube it. So there's no real reason to go for it, unless you like the challenge. Now there is something I want to talk about until I talk about the Japanese versions of the games, but Castlevania Bloodlines is censored in Europe, and has some graphical changes when it went outside of Japan. I just wanted to mention that, and I'll go more in depth at a later time. And finally, let's talk music. Castlevania Bloodlines is composed by Michiru Yamane, sorry if I pronounce it wrong, who will later do the soundtrack for Symphony of the Night, and it shows because Bloodline has an amazing soundtrack. It does have a bit of that Genesis twang, but overall it's really good, even the secret classic tunes. And speaking of classic tunes, the big moment to me in the game is right after you defeat Elizabeth Bartholdi, and you hear the theme of Simon from Castlevania IV. But this time it's a bit slower paced, and it's like the end of a journey across Europe. It's fantastic. Like Super Castlevania IV, Bloodlines is a fantastic game with great music and gameplay, and it's not the end of the Morris and Lecarde legacy. The game does have a sequel in a way with Portrait of Ruin, where you play as John Morris' son, Jonathan Morris. I personally haven't played it yet, but maybe one day. Overall, Castlevania Bloodlines I find is a must-play Castlevania, and it's a great addition to the Anniversary Collection. Now, I'll see you in the next part where I'll look at the 2 Game Boy games in this collection and Kid Dracula. And then we're going to end it all with a look at the Japanese versions. I'll see you in part 3, and hell, with my luck, maybe I'll own both physically Super Castlevania IV and Bloodlines by then. I'll see you all later. Goodbye.